Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at Fossadon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm looking forward to my conversation. We were having some great chats right before in the green room, as you could say, and let's just get right to it. So my guest today is Kris Moore. Kris, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Hey, glad to be here, Isaac. This is great. I'm Kris. I'm the Senior Vice President of Engineering here at IX Systems, one of the guys behind TrueNAS. So happy to be with you today and talk about open source.
Yeah, I'm very excited because as we were talking a bit, I know about TrueNAS and open source like hardware to an extent, but I'm always interested to learn a bit more. And one of the things that I would love to get started with is kind of how you got started. It's like, what is your tech origin story? Like, when did you realize that tech was something that you're interested in?
So now you're going to date me, right? But
Sure, sure,
my
sure.
first computing experience was an Apple II GS that we got at one point when I had to be pretty darn little then. I'm born in 1980. You guys can do the math, figure out how old I am. But after that, we switched to our first PC. I remember this 386 we bought. And the way I got into it was, of course, video games, right? I think
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
X-Wing had just come out, if you guys remember that LucasArts classic. And being able to run that required building boot floppies so you could set different memory options, so you could address all of that awesome 4 megabytes of memory that you had on the on the box. So that was kind of my first foray into figuring out like how boot up works and PCs work and different tunings. I was just a little kid, right? I'm just learning, but that got me really fascinated, and I guess that itch never went away. It just one thing led into another. Next thing you know, I'm grabbing a copy of Visual Basic and trying to figure out how to write little programs, and that led into some C and C++, and then a whole career after that. So, but yeah, people of my generation, you'll remember those early days where running games was not as easy as it is today. My kids have no idea how spoiled they are with Steam. Seriously, it makes me sick sometimes.
It's yeah. It's funny that you bring up Steam specifically because, like I I remember growing up in a world where like you kind of had to carry around the games that you wanted to play, right? And I think that it is. It's funny because there was a thread that I saw on tech social media yesterday about like what are some of the games that you put the most hours into in your life,
Oh yeah.
right? And I was thinking, I'm like, I mean, I haven't played it in probably like 20 years, but I put a lot of hours into like Counter Strike and like half and original Half-Life. Like that was kind of my thing. But like I learned like a lot about computing by
Mhm.
figuring out how to like hide software on like computer labs computers at our school, right? So like we had like this whole like shadow world where you would like hide the Counter Strike program files like in some random folder. This is like Windows 95, Windows 98 time frame, right?
Sure.
So like,
Sure.
you had a bit more flexibility as to what you can do in the operating system. And
Well,
it was always a
I was
cat
gonna
and
say
mouse.
if you want to know, like the kind of thing I was into growing up was all Warcraft and Starcraft, man. That was my jam.
Yeah.
I was a Blizzard guy, hardcore back in the
Yeah.
day, and I remember back, my first foray into TCP/IP networking was Warcraft didn't have support for playing over TCP, so you had to go download an emulator to play IPX over the internet and find other people to play with. It was a good time. You had to learn a lot. You couldn't
Yeah.
just hop on and play a game. You almost had to do research beforehand to figure out how to set up the thing so you could go play the thing.
Yeah, it's quite funny to like I was never I tried to play StarCraft. I was not good. Like I had friends that were very good, so and I got very turned off of being trying to play it because you're losing within the first like 5 minutes if you're not very good at
Hmm.
StarCraft. I think most people that play StarCraft know that. Um, yeah, I mean it's funny that I've had a lot of conversations on this podcast with folks, and it seems to me like that is a huge gateway for folks to get into tech is gaming. And
Hmm.
coincidentally enough, I don't think I've ever interviewed anyone that has actually like been in like game development as a career. And
Okay.
I find it interesting because I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of challenges with being in game development, like it's sprint to ship and things like that. Um, but I do find it very interesting that it's like that. Oh, I want to build something that is fun to use as an end user, right? And coincidentally enough, like we don't end up going into that career, but it's a very interesting way for us to get into it.
Yeah, it introduces you to the concepts, and then you pick up on something and pull that thread later, and that becomes your career, as what happened with me. And kids are still doing that today. My kids, Minecraft is their foray, where they started figuring out like, oh, you can edit files and you can change settings and tweak your Minecraft. Like that's I guess their generation's version of I got into computer programming through video
Sure.
gaming. It's good to see.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and especially depending on when you grew, like when you started getting into tech, right? Some things started to become a bit more accessible. Like
Hmm.
I'm of the time frame where, Web 2.0 was happening, and
Hmm.
like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript was kind of becoming far more easy to build like websites for. And like
Yep.
the first programming language I learned was HTML, right? Like that, I learned
Hmm.
other languages in college, but that was the first one I learned when I was in high school. And like I learned a lot just by trying to break MySpace pages, right? Like playing with all sorts of weird stuff, right? And I think, that general curiosity is something that I think that it carries with a lot of us in tech, especially folks that like to be external facing in tech. Like, do you have
Hmm.
that curiosity factor where, you maybe were a bit of a tinkerer growing up, you like to figure out how stuff was made,
Oh,
and that's kind of that sort of traits have carried you through your personal and professional life?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was the guy who had that T-shirt that said "I void warranties" on it because I would be the one with the screwdriver who's like, "Let's open it up. I want to see how this is built, what's
Yep.
inside it." When my Sega Genesis would break or my controllers would break down, I was the first one to go open it up and splice cables and resolder, broken connections and all that. Yeah, it just, you get that itch, and for some people, it just never goes away.
Yeah.
It was a very early indicator that I was going to get bit hard by the tech bug and never want to
Yeah.
leave. And I'll be doing that till the day I die. I'm looking forward to it. I enjoy it. It's more than just a career. It's a passion and a
Sure.
hobby. And that's one of the things I love about working in tech is working with other people who have those similar itches and bugs where they just love it. They can't help themselves. Even if they weren't getting paid as a day job, they'd still be messing around with computers, building systems, tinkering with source code. It's just in their DNA. It's who they are. And I think that's great.
Was this something that you know, you don't have to go too deep into it, but like your parents, not that they like supporting, but did they understand? Because I think one of the things that I've had conversation with folks as well as myself is like sometimes your parents get it, like, oh,
Hmm.
this kid likes this, let's just try to foster as much as possible, or it's oh, I don't know what this kid is doing, but they're not getting in trouble, so let's just leave them alone. Like, did you have parents that were like, oh, you like computers, you should get as much access to computers as possible?
Yes and no, because depending on what they observe me doing at the time, they
Sure,
see me sitting
sure,
there
sure,
playing
sure.
Warcraft
Yeah,
all day, and it's like he's not doing anything productive. That's Warcraft all day. But
yeah.
they did see the benefit where that would lead into I'm going to the bookstore back. Hey, you remember when we went to bookstores and you'd
Mm-hmm.
actually buy a programming book?
Yeah.
I'm the one buying the Introduction to C book and starting to sit down and fool with programs and write code. And I think that's where they started seeing more of the value in it beyond just playing games. And yeah, so I had again a mixture of that. It just depended on what phase I was in for that year, if it was more playing or the tinkering side. But I always kept coming back to the tinkering. Matter of fact, it's what made me stop playing PC games for a while, just because I would always get fiddly with the system and spend more
Sure.
time,
Yeah.
trying to optimize and set it up perfectly instead of actually enjoying the game. So
We
it
had
just that.
we had a conversation recently on the show where like we talked a lot about overclocking, right? Like
Hmm.
how I think now people that build computers or people that play games like they have like all of this privilege because like it's not super dangerous to overclock anymore.
Hmm.
It used to be
Yeah.
like, oh, you can ruin up a CPU like very very
Hmm.
easily and you can't revert those changes, right?
It was a lot more nerve-wracking when overclocking meant you had to go change pins on a motherboard, and so you're sitting there with your pliers and trying to get
Yeah.
it right. And if you screw it up, you may actually ruin your CPU. And
Yeah.
and especially back then, because usually that was the family computer, and then you got to explain to mom and dad why the computer doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
little more pressure then.
Sure. And that, so, as you're going through this, like, I think at some point, at least now, knowing a little bit about you, like what current Kris is, like, there's like this interesting dichotomy between interest in software versus interest in hardware. Like, at
Hmm.
some point in time, did you realize, like, I like both? Or was there a point in time where you started to work on more software related activities or maybe hardware related activities, and then you kind of realized like I kind of do need to know both to like get the most out of what I'm interested in?
Sure. Well, I definitely started off tinkering a lot more with hardware and building
Sure.
PCs early and understanding parts and components, helped build the first couple family computers. That was all great. But it definitely swerved more towards the software side as I started becoming more of a teenager and going to college. This whole Linux thing was starting to happen. I was
Yeah.
hearing about FreeBSD. My very first job was working at an ISP doing phone support, of course, and
Yep.
helping people with their Windows 95 box connect to this whole dial up internet thing. And that led into one. I remember one day the sysadmin. Back then you had to have a huge gray beard, and like it was a big deal to be back in the sysadmin room, right? And I remember one of the guys back there's like, "Hey, Kris, come take a look at this." And they sat me down at a terminal and was like, "You can log in. We're going to give you an account on this BSD box." And that just opened a whole new world to me. Like, oh wow, there's more than just Windows out here. Like I can learn more about how an operating system works and how the kernel works and drivers work, and how a file system's properly laid out. Windows had kind of made it easy at that point, right? Easier compared to the DOS age. But yeah, that definitely opened my eyes, and that's where the whole swerve into software kind of took off.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting too. I'm not trying to say anything negative about folks like this, but I had a college professor that like was very interested in like the free BSD project, right?
Hmm.
Um, and one of the struggles that I had whenever I took classes with them was they like to do things a very particular way. Because I think one of the things that's really great about technologists is that we all have like our own interests in how we like to do things. And I
Hmm.
remember like having to print out like my source code and like on a notepad and like hand it to him so he could review, right? Because heaven forbid you use an IDE to do some of this stuff, right? But I think
Sure.
what's really interesting, and looking back retrospectively, like it's really important to be able to read code, right?
Hmm.
And I think one of the things
Hmm.
that I'd love to get from you is like, you know, you mentioned like the graybeards, right? So there is like
Sure.
this interesting, I guess, demographic of folks that like to tinker with open source software, with software in general. And that's changing, right? Like you're seeing more and more
Hmm.
people that are really excited about open source development, the use of software. Like, what are some of the things looking back when you were in university or even before that, technology wise, kind of, and now have we swung this other way?
The accessibility element, the internet opened up the doors to everybody. Now, open source meant I could just go point a web browser at a location and boom, I'm viewing source code and I can go read and understand what these programs are doing. And really, for me, it's less about the language and more about people understanding the logic of how do computers work? How do they
Hmm.
think? How do you instruct them? Again, we can get into the specifics of C versus, Golang versus Python, and they all have their own syntax. But at the end of the day, what I found is people really are starting to grok just the whole how do you instruct and what's the logical steps you would take as you write a program? What's a flow look like, versus a web driven program versus something that runs more on the back end as kind of a middleware API thing. The fact that that's all just available at your fingertips, you can go hop on YouTube and watch a video where somebody can explain that to you. You compare back to those old days, I had to physically be in a building where somebody could sit me down at a terminal and kind of show me the ropes, so to
Yeah.
speak. There wasn't this ability to go hop online and kind of self teach. You could go to the bookstore and learn some stuff at school, but even school stuff was usually pretty obsolete by the time I got to it. It's like, oh, late 90s, early 2000s, and the teacher wants to teach Pascal or Fortran. Like, do people still use this? But
Yeah.
being able to hop on the net today has just opened the door to so many different folks. Doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what you look like. Nobody cares. You just, as long as you can go and grok the code, like you can join the club. It's open to everybody.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of really interesting things there, like this idea that things are more open for everybody. That's great. But I think one of the things that I've seen as things get more and more open, there becomes more tools, right?
Hmm.
And I think now we're running to the state where we have kind of tool overload. Like,
Oh, sure.
especially if you talk to like, to use your analogy, the graybeards, right? Like the walk uphill both ways in the snow to get their punch card stamped, right? Like and now like we have you build things in seconds, and you have container orchestration, and you have all these
Mhm.
insane concepts, right? Like,
Sure.
do you think there's a good middle ground, or do you think like having an abundance of of options for tools is of benefit?
Well, I'll give you an example. We'll just pick on editors for a second, right? Yeah, back in ye olden days, the editor was VI. And then, of course, you got Emacs and all these other things. And then you get all your IDEs and all your people program in Notepad, of all things. Um, that's great. Actually, I think having the diversity of tools is a good thing. And then I think over time, people gravitate to the ones that, solve most of the problems for them. And for your information, the correct tool is, of course, VI to use for everything. So I heavily advocate that. But, that said, I think it's better to have a wider diversity of tools because they all have their niche and they all bring certain folks in through certain doors. And once they get in, of course, and you get experienced, you'll figure out later, like, oh, actually, this is the one that's more
Yeah,
optimal for me. And they'll all gravitate to the top five
yeah.
eventually over time. But I'm all about, hey, within open source, you want freedom, you want diversity, you want people to go and try different things, and not all of them succeed. And that's a good thing. But until they go try, you never know if you have like the next killer concept in editors or pick your industry, whatever it is. I think having the ability to go and put it out there and let it sink or swim on its own merit is great.
No, I totally agree. I think options are great. I guess my thought was like if you're new to software development or technology in
Hmm.
general, and like, you know, maybe you have a goal of just trying to get a job, right?
Sure.
And you go to, okay, I'm going to learn how to be a web developer. And you're immediately introduced with like, these are the 400 web frameworks that you can use to build, and these are the tools, and these are all of the package managers and all these things, right? I could imagine it being very, very overwhelming. Not to
Yeah.
say that that's a bad thing, but I think it's
Hmm.
important to call out that like I think you and I, we have a bit of experience with tool churn, whereas new folks
Hmm.
might not.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it can be daunting now just because there are so many options. It's not just that one tool or one book that you go get that's the definitive thing. But I'd recommend to folks the right tool to use is the one you're using at the moment. Learn
Yeah.
as much as you can out of that, and that will help you decide on the next tool that you're going to use that solves your problem better. I would say don't get caught up in the buffet mentality where you can never
Yeah.
sit down and just eat a meal. You're just constantly looking at, well, what about this
Hmm.
framework? Should I do Angular? Should I do React? Should I do this other thing? Pick one, learn it, get good at it. You'll find the problems with it very
Hmm.
quickly and the things you love and the things you hate about it. And that will make you super informed for your next decision. I think that's the way to go about it. Just don't get caught up in being overwhelmed by too many things, too many choices. Pick one and stick to it, at least till you feel knowledgeable enough to move on.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that I've told people when I mentor kind of folks that are getting into career, getting into tech, is like it's okay to like not enjoy stuff. Like
Hmm.
if you don't like something, it just means you should probably stay as far away from that thing as humanly possible. Because
Sure.
there are more than likely other things that you might enjoy that you might not be aware of. It's important to try things, but don't be afraid to like, I'm not gonna do that. Like I
Yeah,
jokingly,
yeah.
I've used this joke a few times. Like I've tried to learn Go like 20 times.
Hmm.
And like Go is different than the languages that I'm more familiar with, a lot different. And whenever I
Hmm.
try to like actually build something, I'm like, oh, I could do this so much faster in other language or other framework. So
Sure.
I immediately like, okay, well, maybe this isn't for me. And that's okay because I'm at least experimenting.
Sure, and you need people who can do other languages. It isn't all a Go world. That's not the one dominant language rule at all. Personally, I like Go. Coming from a C, C++
Yeah.
background, Go is the language I wish I had in the 90s
Sure, sure.
when I was writing a lot of code. But, that's what helps you learn about what your particular niche is going to be. Until you try doing web development in JavaScript or TypeScript, you may love it, you may excel at it, you may dig the whole visual doing CSS type stuff.
Yep.
Great. And then some will hate it and say, I love programming, but I prefer to do more Python and Go and do C and stuff in the background. That's great. But until you try it, you don't know. Like, so we get a lot of these folks who come in, junior intern folks, and they're just getting their feet wet. And that's great. You want to give them exposure to a lot of different projects and types of programming because they'll find that one that they're passionate about. And usually that becomes clear really quickly.
Yeah, that's such a solid point. And I think one of the things that you kind of hinted at is like the availability of folks that have done the job, right?
Hmm.
Like I've seen it plenty of times in my career where you bring in a new developer, maybe they're fresh out of college, maybe they have 1 or 2 years, and you just say, hey, here's a project, have fun. And
Hmm.
that person doesn't have access to a senior level person or a team lead or somebody that they can actually just talk to that's been doing the work. Because I think,
Sure.
I was very fortunate because I had my first job, I had two people that were published authors as like mentors for me when I got started. So I was very fortunate. But I could just imagine, like, especially if you're being hired to, you know, maintain some software, right? Because that happens a
Hmm.
lot. Like you bring in a junior person to like,
Sure.
hey, we're gonna, I know that you got a degree in computer science, but you're gonna maintain this COBOL app for a little bit,
Yeah.
right?
I'm sorry.
And go talk to Jeff if you need to, but Jeff is very busy doing other things, so just try to figure it out, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think the idea of like having like one responsibility that we have in tech is to not like leave that fresh developer like completely paddling as hard as they can, right? So
Sure.
as somebody who has managed large organizations or put together a kind of organizations, like what are some of the things that you've kind of instilled to make sure that when you bring in new people, even if they're experienced, they feel like they have a support system?
Well, you need to make sure they're paired with somebody more senior. I think that's super important. Any code stack, even if you're a seasoned Python developer, you may not know R stack and R Python. It's going to take time to get acclimated. Sure, if you're seasoned, the ramp up may be 3 months instead of 6,
Yeah.
but there's still a ramp up, right? And so having you paired with somebody who kind of knows this and that and been there, done it, and can kind of explain the ins and outs is so important. Making sure somebody's there to help review your code as you're making your first changes, provide guidance, and that kind of review feedback on, well, here's the actual better way we would do that here because we have this other thing you can hook into. That kind of like tribal knowledge transfer is so important on any software project. And I know sometimes you just get thrown to the wolves and it's like,
Yeah.
look, there isn't anybody here, go figure it out, which that is definitely tough, but not optimal. Wherever possible, we try and pair you with a subject matter expert, or at least give you access to a subject matter expert. And what's so beautiful about all this code and things like modern tools like Slack and chat systems and GitHub is it's usually pretty easy to collaborate with folks even on the other side of the world. You can get in touch with somebody who's an SME and can provide you guidance or at least point you in the right direction so you're not spinning too
Yeah.
much of your wheels.
No, it's very true. Like, and I think because of just information technology and all of the things that have happened in the last 30 years, like the ability to talk to somebody in the other part of the world to get help is something that we have this insane amount of privilege and we just completely take it for granted 9 times out of 10,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of the things that is very interesting to me too is, this idea and of if you bring somebody on new to a team and like everybody's been there, they've seen a job posting and it's like, oh, like hit the ground running type of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I whenever I see that I kind of laugh because it's like hitting the ground running, like, I mean, are you running with control or are you rolling running, right? So here's a question for you as somebody who's probably done a fair amount of hiring. What are some
Mm-hmm.
of the skills or some of the traits that you look for in people that, when whether they're seasoned or not seasoned, some of the traits as you go through the interview process when you're talking to folks that you know that they can have success in this field?
Okay, so I'll let you in on my little secret. One of
All
my
right.
my
I'm writing it
questions
down.
I
Hold on.
ask that Okay. Anytime I'm interviewing somebody on the engineering side for some sort of engineering role, one of the weird questions I ask to kind of suss out on if this person is going to work well and be a good fit for us, I ask him, tell me about your personal tech setup at your house. What kind of rack do you
Mm,
have? What kind of systems do you have? Because I'll tell you, with the kind of developers we hire and the team we have here, the person who says, "Oh, well, I got this server set up, and that's where I run my VMware setup, and I do tinkering, and here's where my NAS box is, or my storage, or my,"
yeah.
they start talking about their Raspberry Pis and stuff. I know I found somebody who's passionate
Yep.
about technology and source and all that stuff, usually pretty early on. Where I get worried is when somebody says, "Well, I just have a laptop the company
Yeah,
gives me, and I don't really own any personal tech." And I've had some people say that, like it's a source of pride for them that they don't own any tech. And it's like, think about it this way: if you're going to take your car to a mechanic and he says, "I don't have a driver's license, I don't own a car, and I don't work on cars on the weekend,"
sure.
I have questions, right? I have a little
Yeah,
bit of concern there. If when I'm going to hire a tech or an engineer, I'm looking for somebody who just breathes that. That's just who they are. They can't help themselves. Even I don't even care what job they're in at the moment. They could be in a non-tech job, but if they have that kind of background, I know they're going to be a good fit. And then the rest of it can be taught, right? The hard part is to teach the passion.
yeah,
Once the passion's there, it's much easier for me to go and show you how to do the Python bits or how to make you up to speed with whatever area of our stack you're going to be working on. But again, that's kind of my secret weapon and what I use in the interviewing process. And that's been super successful for me. You know, you give me that person whose eyes light up the moment I ask them to describe their personal gear, and they take pride in that
yeah.
and they're excited about it. I'm like, okay, you're doing well in the interview. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I take the same approach when I'm trying to look for people that would potentially be interested in being on this show, right? Like I think passion for technology is really important. I do want to put one caveat though, and I think like this is fair, and you'll probably agree. It's okay to
Mhm,
just like tech as a job, and not like
mhm.
tech as a way of life. Um,
Sure.
so I mean, you know, but that's beside the point. I think one of the things is there needs to be some healthy balance because I've definitely met people that are kind of obsessed with tech, and I think you've probably
Yeah.
met people like that too. And that's it's great to have hobbies, but from my experience, if your hobby is everything and tech is the same thing
Mhm.
as your hobby, like eventually there's going to be some turning point where you get burnt out, right?
Yeah, there needs to
Especially
be the
like
healthy
yeah,
healthy mix of, hobby versus, other life as well. Definitely. And most of these folks, everyone has their other hobbies, and I build cars on the side, or I tinker on
yeah,
my car, or, I'm an outdoorsman. All that stuff's good as well. But for me, it's about, with so much access to tech today, it's just I want to know that people use it in their daily life somewhere else and have some sort of passion where it demonstrates to me that they've figured things out on their own because they had a personal need or itch to scratch and they went and did it. That's the key thing for me, is knowing that they have those problem solving skills.
yeah. And I know I say that as I'm looking at like a stack of Raspberry Pis. Like it's just
See?
it's just the thing, right?
Yeah,
Like
you can't help yourself.
I can't help myself. And one of the things that I'd love to talk about a bit more too is like we're talking about like like that it's kind of this juxtaposition, this kind of merger of like software development and the tinker mentality, like we talk about Raspberry Pi specifically. And I want to transition our conversation a little bit to like home hardware, right?
Mhm.
I love the ability to like, oh, like I for $40 I can buy a little mini computer and do all these crazy things, right? Or I can go buy a NAS system and or a Synology and do all these cool things, right? You know,
Mhm.
when did you realize at the point in your career in tech where it's like, oh, like the home hacking, the hardware piece of it, like this is where I wanted to put my focus. I know I asked a question in a different way a bit earlier, but like I now that we're at this point where Kris has a career in tech, Kris is doing all these things. They're doing all this stuff with the FreeBSD project. They're a Linux guy. They like playing around with the kernel. But now like I want to play around with like hardware and storage and things like that.
Mhm. So, I guess I'll clarify a little bit on the TrueNAS side. It's not necessarily that the hardware is all open source, but that we are software defined storage, so you can
Yep.
put it on just about any hardware, right? So for me, it's always been more interesting to kind of purpose build. Like I know I want to build a NAS to do X, Y, Z. And I've had my storage needs over the years. I, married, have a lot of kids, which means we have a billion photos we've taken them over
Mm-hmm.
the years. And it's like, where am I going to store those? Because I don't necessarily trust putting them out on the cloud side. And I want to have better controls. And I'm a little OCD that way, right?
Sure.
Um, so okay, how can I build a system that'll best serve that? What software should I run on it? What applications can I use that make it easier to get photos off my wife's iPhone, and I have an Android, and make those all work in harmony, and that starts the project, right?
Yep.
And next thing you know, I'm going out and buying pieces of hardware and setting up a system and getting hard drives, and now I got a rack in my home office and it's a little noisy in there. So,
Yeah. Sure.
but that's how it starts.
Yeah, it's quite interesting too. So like I've done this weird balancing, and I think a lot of it has been related to like end user experience. So at the moment, we're using a very well known cloud provider for
Mhm.
like storing files and images and pictures and things like that. And the reason why I went
Sure.
down this path is I had like my own home network with all this stuff, and what it ended up causing the reason to switch is because I didn't want to build a mobile app that had specific features for my wife to be able to do some of the things she wanted to do. And some of the
Mhm.
tools that existed didn't. So I was like, okay, I could try to figure this out using a hodgepodge of miscellaneous things, or I could spend, $3 a month on cloud
Sure.
storage, right? And I always kind of struggle with the like, I kind of am the, I like to fix things myself. I like to be the tinkerer. I like to be the person that plays with things and figure out how to do things. And then I just kind of
Mhm.
punted it to like, I'm just going to pay somebody to do it for me. And
Sure.
I'd love to get your thoughts because there is this decision tree that needs to happen where it's how much does like in personal investment in time and money and resources
Mhm.
versus just paying somebody to do the work for you.
Yeah. Yeah, there's convenience versus cost, and like the
Yeah.
cost could also be your time and effort and energy. So completely get that. I guess, everyone has their tipping point or
Yeah.
threshold, because if you woke up tomorrow and your personal cloud bill for the family photos was $200 a month, you might start going,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
maybe I want to do something different now, right? That's kind of where I'm at. I had a huge, I'm a movie guy, so I had a huge Blu-ray library for years, hundreds and hundreds of Blu-ray discs. And at some point, I realized my kids never watched any of these Blu-rays because they were too lazy to go put a disc in the player. Like
Yeah.
that, Dad, that's so old school. Like you actually have to get a disc. That's weird. So I digitized them all and put them all on my Plex box. And
Yep.
now you're talking, tens and tens and tens up to hundreds of terabytes of space that if I had to go dump that all on a cloud provider and be paying egress charges every
Oh yeah.
time we
Yeah.
watch a movie, it gets expensive fast, right? But I'm a
Yeah.
bit of a movie snob and I like my quality and I don't like, paying for the same content 18 times. So I went down that path. The next thing I got a NAS, and that made sense. People have those kind of tipping thresholds. Some other folks I've met, they have their Steam library downloaded and backed up, and it's all saved and stored locally, and that's how they do their LAN parties and all that good stuff. But it's about finding your particular needs and then just designing the right solution. Sometimes the answer is, hey, it's throw $2 at something and
Yeah.
just make the problem go away. Completely get that. But then you'll hit a threshold where it's like, it's not $2 anymore,
No.
or I have other
Yeah.
needs for privacy or security concerns, and so I'm going to go and do a little bit extra effort to set something up locally.
Yeah, as somebody who is similar, like so for photos, it's specifically like cloud based because but
Mhm.
for like other media, like music or movies or whatever,
Yeah.
like yeah, I have the same thing. I have a Plex box. I have all this stuff, right? And it's funny because I've realized more and more recently that I don't watch as much stuff on Plex anymore because the movie that I'm looking for is available on some streaming platform.
Hmm.
And my kids, I have younger kids. My kids know what Plex is, but my kids typically will go to Disney Plus or they'll go to Netflix or
Sure.
whatever, right? And I think yeah, there is something to say where like, oh well, if you add all the streaming services up, like it's a couple $100 a month, right? Um, versus using Plex and hosting all that stuff. But I'd love to
Hmm.
get your thoughts as like, especially as somebody who appreciates like, and I don't want to use the phrase data hoarding because that's a whole different thing, but it is kind of like data hoarding a little bit.
Sure.
Um, how often do you use Plex versus other services that you can probably get content on? I'm just out of curiosity.
So I use it a fair amount. So not more than just data hoarding. I'm a bit of a movie snob, and that means quality and audio
Yeah.
quality and video quality. So I want max bit rate on everything, and I
Hmm.
don't want the recompressed, re-encoded, low bit rate version that a lot of streaming services offer. So yeah, I'm that guy. I have a home theater set up with the big
That's
projector,
why
4K
you,
projector, Dolby
yeah,
Atmos. So those things matter to
you
me.
have
And so
taste.
yes,
Yes, you have
I have
taste.
I have taste.
Yeah.
Again, it's like if you're a car guy, not to pick on car people, but if you're a car person, you're telling me your favorite car is your Toyota Echo that you
Hmm.
drive, like I'm gonna have questions about that. Now, when you roll up in your hot rod and it's all, that's what I do on the Plex side with movie quality.
Yeah.
It's got to be like I got to have my hot rod.
No, I totally relate to that. I think too, like there is something to say about taking some pride in something that you built, right? Because
Hmm.
you built your own internal infrastructure, right? Like
Yep.
you had, and I don't know how you have this configured, but like, oh, maybe you have just Plex running on a container on some box, or maybe you have other stuff. Maybe you are using some out of the box. It doesn't matter. But like,
Well,
you built it, you put it together. I have a
well,
friend.
I,
Sorry, good.
let's say I eat my own dog food there, so it's
Yeah,
Plex running on TrueNAS scale, of
there we
course, which
go.
is what we
Yeah,
build. It works, so
yeah.
it's a good fit. Like I said, I believe in running the things that you work on. So
Yeah, I have a friend who's like very big into home automation. Like to the effect that they had a grill and they didn't like the way that the grill was feeding pellets into it, into the auger to basically heat their or cook their food. So he wrote his own software to repurpose that using temperature gauges and a Raspberry Pi and all this stuff, right? So he's like very big in that space. Um, and it's funny because I asked him one time, like, so what would happen if you decided to move? He's like, I would just do it all again. I would do all of it.
yeah.
Lights, refrigerator, like his refrigerator, like if you open it and it's open for 10 seconds, like the house starts to like siren. Like
Hmm.
it's great. But at the same time, it's like it's a lot of effort. And you know, to your
Well,
point, like if you don't watch it enough, you might not get as
yeah.
much value out of your investment.
Yeah, that's a case of where in that specific situation, I would just go buy the thing off of Amazon and be like, I don't have time to fiddle with that.
Yeah.
But I have my own personal interests and my
Sure.
tastes, and he would
Yeah.
probably just go buy Disney Plus and stream his thing that way.
Yeah.
Great,
Yeah, no, we,
to
we
each
don't
their own.
we don't kink shame here. Like you're all like you can do whatever you want. Like I think one of the things that's very interesting to me specifically you mentioned is that like you're in a space professionally
Hmm.
that allows you to I don't want to say get access, but have a bit more insight into some of these things that we're talking about, like quality of content, egress,
Yeah.
outgress, like storage. So, what was it specifically about storage that interested you so much?
So, IX, the company I work for, we originally acquired the FreeNAS project. I think, gosh, going on a decade now. Um, And FreeNAS, of course, is for home labbers
Yep.
and folks to go build their software-defined RAID, and then ZFS got introduced to that, which is kind of the last word on file systems and protection and bit rot protection, all that good stuff, right? Instant snapshots. And I started tinkering with that around that time. And I should say, this looks interesting. I should use this. The first interest was I could use this at my own house, and use
Yeah.
it at home. And I'm a home labber too. And then one thing led to another, and then it got more interesting as well. Like, well, what are the other things we can do on this? You can run home automation on it. You can run apps on it. You can do arbitrary workloads. You can find other ways to serve data for your kids. You setting I can't tell you how many people have told me I first got into FreeNAS and TrueNAS by setting up a Minecraft server
Yeah.
like to play games for
Hmm.
their kid. Like having a persistent Minecraft world was huge, right? Everybody has those couple things that scratch that itch, and so I'm no different. I had mine, and it just happened to be that's something that my company was making, and so I was able to get involved and more involved, and eventually leading that department. But yeah, it still keeps me interested to this day. And on my weekends, yes, I'm still going and playing with TrueNAS and
Yeah.
setting up my stuff at the house. Like I said, the latest app I'm messing around with is great for backing up photos off our phones and being able to quickly search and make albums and do all the things you would do with like various Google apps or whatnot for
Yep.
storing your photos in the cloud. Except I all do it locally now, and I have unlimited space essentially because I can throw all the terabytes I want at it.
Yeah, it's funny because this is something that's been around for a while, but I think because of some of the innovation that's been done in hardware and things like that, it's been made it's substantially more accessible. I worked with a guy probably 10 years ago that had systems where if a new device like a new like iPod connected to his internal network, you would download from the iPod like the music onto it. Like he would do all these things, and I was just shocked about the amount of effort that he would do to kind of like you said, just like geek out on his home lab, right? So
Mhm.
I don't know the history very well, but when did it start to become like a non niche thing to like do home labbing, data storage on your own internal networks? Like when did it become like a really big thing?
Oh, I guess it depends on which group you're talking to, right?
Sure.
But I mean, in the gaming community, of course, it's always been more fun and efficient to run a game server locally, better
Yep.
latency and all that. So, but if you get into like comparing to like cloud storage, for example, people who when they hit that tipping point of I have too much data that it's costing me too much, or I need to get it back, and oh, that was painful because it took so long to re-download. I think there's folks who at that tipping point now it's like I need to set up my home lab. Um, Again, everybody has their different interests. Yeah, 3D printing could be on it too, is
Yeah.
where I store all my
Yeah.
3D printing things. So it's different for every person and for every niche, but it's becoming less and less niche because especially as open source is now offering more and more, I guess, viable alternatives to what used to be considered closed source things where there just wasn't an open source alternative to get. And of course, the cost,
Yeah.
right? Because 9 times out of 10, you're not paying for a lot of open source is free, quote unquote, to download. Um, it just makes it more interesting now. I can go run all my home automation. I don't
Yeah.
need to have, the name brand ones, and I can do more interesting things with it. And I have better controls over it. And I can trust that it's not going to go down because, the cloud provider went away or changed it and broke me all overnight. I have a little more control over that.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with like the phrase NAS, right? Like I think if
Mhm.
you have been following tech for a little bit, you're familiar with the concept, but you're talking specifically about like open source NAS or true NAS. So you want to maybe give folks that are tuning in a little bit of backstory as to the TrueNAS project and kind of its history.
Sure. Sure. Again, TrueNAS was FreeNAS many, many years ago, and FreeNAS was a cool way to take FreeBSD, and they spun it up with some neat packages that allowed you to go and basically set up a SMB share on your network or an NFS share on your network and attach your clients and store your data, and then trust that your data would be kept intact even if you had a hardware failure. Right?
Sure.
That was really the selling point. And then over time, it kind of grew and evolved, and the ZFS file system got introduced, which brought essentially the first enterprise grade type functionality to something that was free and open source. We're talking a file system that was invested in heavily by Sun back in the day, right?
Yep.
Now Oracle. And so all of a sudden you have all these enterprise features at your fingertips, like automatic checksumming and dedupe and inline compression, and all these neat things you used to have to pay for. And I can do it with a free download and put it on commodity hardware that I had sitting around, maybe even old hardware. That's how a lot of people started. And that became very quickly popular. Over time, got rebranded into TrueNAS, which of course helps marry it to more of our enterprise offerings that we do on the IX side. And people very quickly discovered that the same system I use at home in my home lab, I can also use at work and scale up to X amount of petabytes, 20
Yeah.
plus petabytes on one box, which is ridiculous to think about, but that's in the real world when you're playing the big system, sure,
Yeah.
that's not very unreasonable. A lot of people are doing that. And then they were introducing that into their VMware infrastructure, like, oh, we can use this as the backing storage for VMware. Works great. Um, it's really kind of taken off in a lot of unique ways, but not as niche as it used to be, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me how this happens time and time again where you see some community backed project or community started project start to get adoption from enterprise, right? And
Hmm.
I don't know if it's like a chicken or egg thing, if like more people come because the enterprise brings credibility to it, or the enterprise comes because the community has been like, this is the choice, like this is the thing, do the thing. Do you have any sort of insight maybe onto that specific thing about when you would expect to, if you have, is it community led or is it enterprise business led?
Well, in the case of FreeNAS, TrueNAS, sorry, I'm gonna have to break a
No, go
second. My
ahead.
voice is
Go
starting to
take.
break here.
No worries.
Excuse me about that. Yeah, I just traveled recently, and so I'm still a little congested. All right. If you want to dive right back in and set that up, I'm happy to
Yeah,
re-answer.
yeah. So my question more or less was, is some of these things are they community started, because
Hmm.
and the enterprise adopts it because the community is engaging around it, or do
Sure.
you see more community growth because enterprise has brought credibility to it?
Well, definitely the first one in this case, right? The community started because the community had an itch to scratch. People
Mhm.
wanted to set it up, run it in their home labs, but that was kind of the secret weapon because people started getting really comfortable with it at home. And guess what? The people playing with it were the IT crowd who were then responsible for storage at work. And next thing you know, they're taking it to work and kind of pitching it as the enterprise solution for work. And of course, the IX business has grown up around that and then is there to provide that need as well. but definitely was driven and kind of led by the community side initially. And of course, now that we have TrueNAS and the enterprise, we're very focused on making sure it's enterprise grade and always ensuring that quality level and checking all those enterprise boxes. I mean, that's how developers get paid. We all like to work
Yeah.
on these things too. But community is definitely heavily involved, and it's great because that's how we can catch trends too as we see new things come to market or new protocols or new things that people want to do on their NAS array. The community is usually the first ones who are going to go tinker with that. Enterprises tend to be more conservative and lag
Yeah.
behind what the general industry can do. So it's a great way for us to kind of get our feet wet and try things out before it would go and roll out into more of an enterprisey project and needs to be more battle hardened. But you have the ability to tinker and do all that on the exact same system. Try doing that with your closed source,
Yeah.
hideously expensive enterprise box.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm gonna go off on a little bit of a tangent, so I apologize, but I'd love to get your thoughts after it. So, like, as somebody
Sure.
who in my career, I've talked to all sorts of folks, and some folks they have a bit more influence at their company, but I've also talked to folks that don't have any influence at their company at all. So, I'd love to get your thoughts about, you know, say for instance I'm a new company and all of a sudden I have a need for like storage at scale, quote unquote,
Mhm.
right? Um,
Sure.
I can do the Google research, I can do all this stuff, but eventually I need to pick some
Mhm.
tool. Like what
Mhm.
is so advantageous about choosing an open source tool in this case, versus maybe a closed source tool like you're saying? Like one
Sure.
is like to an extent free and open and all these great things, but there is a bit more, I guess, assumption that your closed source is going to have better support because of
Okay.
reasons, right? So like I'd love to
Sure.
get your thoughts a little bit about that dichotomy.
Well, I think that was definitely the old school mentality that,
Sure.
oh, closed source, got to have a big company behind it, it'll be better supported. But I think that that's kind of flipped around these days. Open source, in a way, is more open and transparent. We got nothing to hide, and frankly, we can't hide it, right? Keeps us honest. And because it's free and open source, you don't have to take our word for it. Go download it, deploy it, run it yourself, try before you buy, to the nth degree. You can do that and at the same time go review and see what it's actually doing under the hood to make sure that what we claim matches what you see the code doing.
Yeah. Uh,
So very different. And when you pick an open source granted, there are some open source projects that don't have any commercial backing. I get it.
mhm.
They're small niche projects. But when you pick an open source project that's backed by a good company that's been around for a long time, it kind of takes away those doubts and worries about, well, does it have good support? Well,
Sure.
no, it definitely does. And not only that, I would argue a higher level of quality of support because, again, we can't hide our dirty laundry. We have
Yeah.
to fix it in the open for everybody to see and do it right, and so we have a vested interest in doing things the right way the first time.
Yeah, battle tested, right? Like,
Yeah.
whenever, like, if you've ever built software, like, and I don't know if this is a phrase that you've heard or people that are tuning in have heard, but like, I've always heard the phrase gorilla proof, right? Like, you're gonna build software that a gorilla could destroy, and you would still be, you wouldn't have bad data coming in, you wouldn't have security vulnerabilities, you want it to harden or make robust systems, right? And I think you would probably contest is the open source community is a very good judge of these sort of
Hmm.
things because if they don't like
Yeah.
something, if they don't think something is safe, they're going to move on to the next thing because I think it's fair to say in an open source world where everybody has an opinion, you're going to
Hmm.
find another solution that has the same methodologies but from a more opinionated view.
Absolutely. Like I said, it keeps us honest. And we had a saying, maybe not gorilla tested, but we like to say your hard drives are out to get you because
That
hardware
that's
fails.
that's even better. That's even better.
Your hardware is going to fail. It has happened or it hasn't happened. It's going to happen. The question is, what can we do to help prevent that and help you recover from it? And that's where I think people know, we put our money where our mouth is.
Yeah, and as somebody who has dealt with a failing hard drive, there is nothing more frustrating on the planet than a failing hard drive, right?
Absolutely.
Like not just because of like the way to validate your hard drive is failing it can be challenging at times, but also like if you're not properly set up with backups and raids and things like that, you're talking about losing data.
Yeah.
And I used to work, folks who know me, I used to work at Geek Squad when I was in college. So
Okay.
like we
Yep.
would have people bring their computers in. My computer doesn't turn on. I have all these pictures. Can you please save them? And like there's nothing worse than having a conversation with somebody about like, oh yeah, all those family photos that you have, all that music, it's gone. Like we
Your
can
data
send it.
really is your life in a
Yeah,
way. You spent hours of your life you could never get back generating that data, and to lose it is just horrible.
yeah, and unfortunately, like there are approaches to like recover data, but they're not
Mhm.
accessible for people like me or people like you.
Yeah.
You know, it's so
Most people
it
can't afford to send a drive off to a repair shop to try
even
and recover
even
data from a
even
platter. That's
yeah,
expensive.
yeah, even like the base level, like I don't remember the exact prices, but like you would tell people how much it cost, and people would say, how is it that much money? I'm like, because they know
Yeah.
that is the last that is the last option, right?
They
Like
know
if
what
you,
your data is worth to you.
yeah,
Right?
right, like it's one of
Yeah.
those things, and this is probably a bit too on the nose, but it's like, how much is this, like, like kind of empty checkbook sort of thing, right?
Hmm.
And like I've done every, like the, freezing hard drives in rice, whatever, like all the
Oh
things, right?
gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, like, and we've all done that if we've had data failure, and that moment just like, is this stuff really worth, you know, $300, and then to send you a note
Yep.
back saying your data is unrecoverable? If you want us to go even further, it's $1,500. Like, and as
Yeah.
in, if you know how old hard drives work, maybe not as much solid state drives, but if you know how hard drives work, every time that disk spins, you have less likelihood of getting data off that disk,
Yeah.
right?
SSDs are not immune too. They will
Yeah,
eventually wear out and fail. You will lose data. It's like you said, it's your hard drives are out to get you.
yeah.
What can you do to stop that? I mean, 20 years of photos of my kids, we've only ever lost photos once, and it was because the phone that had them hadn't been backed up yet and got dropped
Mm.
in water, I think is what it was.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
But every single photo we've ever backed up to our TrueNAS, I got 20 years of history and I'm keeping that and it's all backed up and replicated. And, the house could burn down tomorrow and we could still get our data back. Like that's just how we do it. But it's so important to have that because once it's gone, you just can't get it back. It's gone.
Yeah, and I think that's, the most important thing that, this very sad conversation that I'd like folks to take away from is that there is technology there, and
Hmm.
in a lot of cases it's not super expensive, it's not really challenging to implement, that can save your future self. And I'm very much of the belief that all we're doing right now in this moment is to save ourselves in the future,
Yeah.
either from doing making a mistake, or making the wrong choice, or stepping into traffic, or whatever it is, right? Like we're
Yeah.
all
Well,
in the process of bettering ourselves in the future.
there's always a car analogy for something storage related. So again, it's like your car. You buy the car with all the safety features, and the odds are you'll probably never use them. Hopefully,
Yep.
your car never get in a bad wreck.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, you put money and effort and time into buying all those good safety features to make sure, should the unthinkable happen, everyone walks away. Right.
Yeah.
That's the important thing you got to think about with your storage. Put all that money into the safety features, hoping you never use them. But when you do, they're ready and there for you.
Yeah, it's gambling, right? Like
Hmm.
insurance, these things, like all these things are just
Yeah.
gambling that the worst thing can't happen. Let's move on to a better topic, right? I think one of the
Okay.
things that is very interesting to me as well about the storage space, and we talked about a little bit, is that, you know, you're seeing more and more like utilities that people can buy off the shelf, right? And
Sure.
I'd love to get your thoughts too, as somebody who has probably played around with Synologies, or name your other like NAS box setups, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the advantages of those versus building yourself? And we talked about this a bit, like, what's your level of interest as a car
Sure.
mechanic? But like, what are some of the out of box features that people that might not even consider building it yourself, like, what are some of the things they can take advantage of pretty quickly?
Well, I think for those systems you mentioned, a lot of people, it's just convenience. I can throw some money at a problem, plug a thing in, walk away, and not think about it. But at the end of the day, we do the same thing on the TrueNAS side, where we have our own kind of TrueNAS minis, for example,
Yeah.
that would compete with like a Synology, for example, where it's the same thing. You buy it, the hardware's all done and set, and you just kind of plug it in, use it, and forget it, right? Um, the important thing to look at when you go buy any solution like that is what the longevity of it is too. Because remember, you're going to be storing data on this potentially for a long time.
Yeah.
What's the availability of updating it, moving data in and out? Are you locked into a closed ecosystem? We all, in this day and age, most people know about closed ecosystems where it's hard to get your things
Yeah.
out, right?
Yeah.
They make it easy to bring it in, but not to get it out later when you need to, which will happen eventually. And that's where I would argue and preach that TrueNAS or an open source system makes a lot more sense because you have that ultimate flexibility. You're not locked into any one ecosystem. It's your data. We want to just enable you for storing it safely and moving it around in or out. At the end of the day, we're a tool to be used, and we're not trying to just lock you into an ecosystem forever for nefarious reasons.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find fascinating about this space too, especially, and this is kind of double clicking into what you're working on, is like there
Mhm.
are experts, right? Like there are folks that know how to do these things. If you're a bit cautious, if you want to play around with it, but like you don't want to take the plunge for whatever reason, right?
Sure.
If you're doing this for personal use, you can take advantage of the open source community. If you're doing it for business use, professional support or professional support or professional services are there, right? Like,
Mhm.
what are some of the things when, you've talked to a lot of customers around this space, like what are some of their initial concerns with adopting some of these technologies?
Well, again, where do I get expert help?
Yeah.
If you're on the enterprise side, the commercial side, of course, you can reach out to IX and we'll take good care of you, right? But on the open source side, there's a huge vibrant community around it, and that's where it's important when you pick an open source project, pick one that's got a robust, vibrant community where you can go and Google questions and find answers and ask questions when you run into that brick wall and you're not quite sure how to proceed. And I'd argue we have a pretty good size one, definitely a good size one. And there's a reason why we're the largest software-defined storage around the world is because people are deploying it and running it. And there's a lot of these systems in the wild worldwide. You can always find some local help.
That's great. And as we wrap up this conversation, one of the things that I'd like to finish on is, you've seen like this progression, in your career from this is very, niche technology, something that, like you said, people that have taste only
Hmm.
play with, to like, it being more or less a commodity for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that, if you were to do a retrospective, things that might have been done incorrectly in the past, or things that, now if you see how people use it, that, oh, if I would have known this is the application of it or the appliance of it, maybe we would have done something a bit differently. What are some of the things that you've, catch 22 sort of thinking?
Well, I think the dual-edged sword of open source is it kind of grows organically, which is good and
Yeah.
bad. Sometimes you got to look back now, as we're doing with the TrueNAS Scale product, and we're going through and purpose designing things a little better instead of organically grafting on features, which happens to any open source project over time. You reach that point where it's like, okay, now I'm going to go back and we have to redesign that more as a design feature to work better with other parts of the system and just make a more cohesive I guess, easy to use customer experience, right? That's a big part of any open source project. Again, dual edged sword. You want that organic growth. It's great to grow organically and bring things in and kind of graft things on. But you also have to go back and say, now let's go and kind of redesign features. We like to say paying down technical debt
Yeah.
is important
Yeah.
in any project, not even just open source projects, but definitely in open source projects.
Yeah, I like to use the, not a car analogy, so I'm sorry, but like the painting the barn analogy, right? Like
Hmm.
you come in every day and you paint the barn red. Every day you put on another fresh coat of paint. Barn's great. Everybody loves the barn. And then somebody
Hmm.
comes in, hey, that barn should be white,
Hmm.
right? It's funny because I heard that when I was just getting started. I didn't get it, right? I didn't
Yep.
like, okay, so that, I mean, whatever. But now, like, as a more crusty developer, a crusty person that's been in technology, like the need to always adapt for change is really, really important. And it sounds to me
Hmm.
like in this space, you folks are taking extra interest in making sure that not just enterprise customers, but also the open source community
Yeah.
is making sure, like keeping you honest, as you said earlier.
Mhm. Absolutely. Keeping us honest and giving us that feedback where things could use extra love and polish and where we could make that knob easier to turn or make that indication a little easier to read. Like all that feedback is super valuable, and we love our open source community for providing that. And the important part of any open source project is to listen. If you hear enough people saying the same thing, the squeaky wheel, there's probably a reason
Yeah,
for that. You should go
this is
take a
true.
look at that and see if you can find a way to do it better.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And with that, we're about to wrap up the show. And Kris, this has been great. It's been really interesting, like knowing more about the space as somebody who knew it at a very high level, but it's also been great getting to know you and how you think about things because I've definitely learned some things. As we wrap up, I do like to ask my guests one final question,
Sure.
and it's probably the hardest question you'll ever get asked, right? If you can think of, if the conversation we've just had, and think your career in technology, your interest in all these different areas of technology, open source community, storage, but you only had one word to think about when you thought about those things. One word to describe that feeling. What would that word be for you?
Change.
Change. Change is good. Always.
Well, because it's always changing, and you have to get comfortable with that and roll with it. I've had the conversation with many of my engineers, like, don't get too married to a particular piece of technology. We live in an industry defined by change,
This is
and
very
so you
true.
have to be prepared and to embrace it.
I completely agree. Like how long were we talking about this technology is going to revolutionize the world and 3 years later its replacement showed up, right?
Yep,
Um,
absolutely.
Yeah, and that is the end of our conversation, and I've had a great time. If folks want to learn more about what Kris is doing at iSystems, or even learn more about TrueNAS, you can follow him on Twitter, for instance. Yeah, it's at Kmore Says, so KMOORESAYS, and you can probably find
Mhm.
him all sorts of different places. And there's going to be some links to down to different some of the things we talked about in the show notes. So with that, Kris, do you have any parting words to say before we sign off?
No, this was a pleasure, Isaac. Happy to be here, and I am pretty active online. So again, on Twitter, I lurk on the Reddit side for TrueNAS as well, and of course, we have our own forums and our own Discord server. So again, I'm pretty accessible. Send me an email, open a pull request if you want to see something new added to TrueNAS. We love those too.
Yeah, please contribute in any way that you can. Like, even if you don't want to write code, you can write docs, you can write test cases, you
Absolutely.
can do whatever, right?
See a
That's
typo, fix it. It's all there.
exactly awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time, Kris, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in, whether it's right now or in the future. This is Isaac Levin. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.